He gave you everything. The music that felt like it was written specifically for you. The performances that made you feel things that you didn't have words for. A sound so complete, so fully realized that it became the soundtrack to your entire chapters of your life. And then he took it away. No warning, no farewell tour, no final album dedicated to the people who'd given him everything in return. The Revolution, the most gifted band he ever assembled, the group behind the greatest run of his music career. It was simply gone. It was disbanded overnight, erased overnight. And if you're honest, you never got over it. Not because the music stopped, because Prince kept making music, but because something about that felt alive, something that had felt like a conversation between him and you was suddenly stopped and permanently closed. No one saw that there could be a way back. People probably hoped, I know I had hoped, what you felt was real and it had a name. And I've been wanting to talk about this for ages. I've talked about it with those closest to me. You were abandoned. And here is what this video is going to show you. Prince didn't just abandon the revolution. He abandoned every band he ever built, every woman he ever loved, every friendship that got too close. Now there's a theme here. Every person who gave him their loyalty, their talent, their devotion, because you had to be devoted if you were going to be around him. And the reason he did it traces back to a wound so early, so deep, and so perfectly hidden behind the most controlled public image in the history of popular music, that it took 40 years, a suppressed Netflix documentary, and it took the testimonies of people who loved him to even begin to name it. And they didn't really name it. By the end of this video, I will name it. You will understand not just what Prince did, but why. And that understanding won't make you love the music less. It will make you hear it differently, more honestly, more clearly, more humanly. Because every song that he ever made was his wound speaking. And once you hear it, you cannot unhear it. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe here on YouTube. And if you're listening on Apple or Spotify, tap auto download so new episodes are ready for you every time they drop. Now, let's dive in. But before we go there, let me just tell you who I am and why I'm the person taking you into this. I analyze high-stakes performers and achievers. I take you behind hidden group dynamics. That's my specialty. Leadership, the psychology of toxic workplaces, and what they do to the people inside of them. I've seen it firsthand, and I have always been drawn to bands because a band is a workplace. It has a hierarchy, a power structure, creative tension, financial dependency, and most of all, ego. All compressed, all sort of compressed into a nice little space where people are expected to produce genius on demand. if dysfunction exists anywhere in that system, the stage will expose it. The studio will amplify it. The success will accelerate it. I was the kind of kid in the audience at these concerts. I mean, I think my first concert, I must have been 5 or 6. I was dancing, singing every word. And then, as I got older, I started to buy the teen magazines and read them. And I was thinking, that's not the person I watch perform. There's something very different here. Something else is happening here. Something nobody's talking about, nobody's naming. There are other dynamics here. So later, when I got to be around some of my favorite groups and musicians, including my cousin Lawrence, who's a jazz-based musician, he performed with people like Irma Thomas and Smokey Wilson. It solidified my observations. I was privy to sitting into some rehearsals with his younger bands, and I could see those dynamics. Now, I get to name it now from an informed psychological, forensic, and neuroscience perspective because of my training. And with Prince, a man I saw perform in person many times, whose world I got close enough to touch in a way, and I'll tell you about how I got close enough. And I've been wanting to name it for a long, long time. Everything I'm about to show you about Prince, the control, the financial manipulation, the systemic dismantling of very talented people, I see versions of it every single week in the workplaces that my clients come from. And I've seen it firsthand myself. Different industry, different scale, different stakes, same wound driving the exact same patterns. I put together a toxic workplace recovery kit that breaks down exactly how these dynamics operate and what to do when you're inside of one. The link is in the description. But stay with me to the end of this video and I'll come back to it. Because what you're about to understand about Prince, you're probably going to want it. To understand what was taken from you, you first need to understand what the revolution was. Not the mythology, because we could go on about that. I won't. The reality. Prince and the Revolution became the first artist since the Beatles to simultaneously hold the #1 film, album, and single in the United States. That was unsurmountable. Purple Rain spent 6 consecutive months at the top of the Billboard 200. It has sold over 16 million copies in the United States alone. I must look at the UK charts. Chartmaster, which is who I got the information from, they're considered one of the most rigorous ranking tools in music analysis, places Purple Rain, 1999, and Diamonds and Pearls as Prince's top 3 commercial achievements. Prince himself, now this is shocking to me, but Prince himself ranks number 36th among all artists and their all-time ratings and rankings, with the Beatles at number 1. 36. Incredible. Bobby Z, the Revolution's drummer, described the moment that Wendy Melvoin joined the band and completed the lineup by comparing it to the Beatles finding Ringo Starr. That's not a fan speaking. That's a man who was inside the room. Now, let me address this because I can already hear people going, oh, what about MPG? So the MPG were extraordinary musicians. Prince continued to make important music after 1986. So he carried on. Nothing in this video disputes that. Nothing. But the charts don't lie. The cultural penetration doesn't lie. Purple Rain was not just a great album. It was a civilizational, it was a civilizational moment, a cultural moment. The Revolution were the band that made that moment possible. Comparing their commercial and cultural impact to any subsequent Prince project is not a matter of opinion. I'm not giving my opinion here. It's a matter of record. Look it up. Like I did preparing for this video. So let's go back just a bit because I want to paint a bit of a picture here. It's 1986. How old am I? It's 1986. Prince is at the absolute peak of his career. Purple Rain has pretty much redefined popular music. Everybody was talking about it. Around the World in a Day has gone to #1. Parade is in the stores now. The Revolution are, by, I suppose, any objective measure, the most commercially successful band in the world. And then, over dinner, Prince tells them that it's over. No forewarning, no extended conversation. Wendy Melvoin, Lisa Coleman, Brown Mark, Bobby Z, and Matt Fink, the people who'd helped create the greatest run of his career, think about that, are informed that the Revolution no longer exists. There are multiple interviews by different Revolution members talking about this. So let's look at this. There was no artistic failure, no commercial collapse, no creative exhaustion that demanded a new direction. You know, bands can overextend themselves. The Revolution were disbanded at the precise moment they were most, I'm going to use the word essential, certainly most successful, and I'm even going to say mostly irreplaceable. You know, for years, the official explanation was creative restlessness. None of his real fans bought that. Prince needed to evolve, of course. Prince needed to move forward, of course. Prince was always moving forward. We can see that. But there is another explanation, one that is more uncomfortable, I would say, one that is more human, and one that, once you hear it, you cannot dismiss this. Prince disbanded the Revolution because he could no longer tolerate what they knew about him. Wendy Melvoin was not just Prince's guitarist. She was the sister of Susanna Melvoin, Prince's fiancée. Think about what that means inside of a band. Wendy and Lisa Coleman were not just musicians in Prince's employ. They were people with a direct, personal, intimate window into how Prince treated the women, I'm going to say, he claimed to love. And Prince, as we will come to understand in detail, did not treat Susanna well. He was unfaithful. He was controlling. He abandoned her emotionally, repeatedly, before he abandoned her formally. For a man whose entire psychology was built around controlling who could see what, who could hear what, who could know what. Wendy and Lisa represented something I believe was intolerable for him. They were what we call witnesses. People whose loyalty to Susanna meant that their presence in his band was a constant, silent judgment. He knew what they thought about his behavior. You cannot gaslight someone whose sister is standing next to her in the backing band. The disbanding of the revolution was not just creative decision. It was removal of people who knew too much. People whose continued presence made it impossible for Prince to control the narrative of who he was. This analysis was never made public before now. Through me, I'm seeing it as it is, but the documented facts support it entirely. And as we examine the patterns Prince's behavior showed across his entire life, you'll see that this was not an isolated incident. It was what I would call an operating system. We all have them. Now, some of you may be thinking, oh, well, that's speculation. Well, you're right that I cannot read Prince's mind, and he's not here to tell me. Nobody can. What I can do, and what I am doing, is applying established psychological frameworks to documented, publicly available evidence, including Prince's own words from his own unfinished memoir. When a pattern repeats across every relationship, every band, every friendship, every marriage or deep relationship, across a 40-year career, it stops being speculation and starts being data. I'm not diagnosing Prince. I'm describing a pattern that he himself acknowledged in his own handwriting 4 days before he died. To understand why Prince did what he did to the revolution, you need to understand where Prince came from and what that means going back to Minneapolis in the 1960s, really to a household defined by two things that would shape every single relationship he ever had: music and abandonment.
Never miss a show by clicking the subscribe button right now. Thank you for your support. You make this podcast possible. Now, back to the show.
Prince was born in June of 1958, and his father was a jazz musician, his mother a jazz singer. His father named him Prince, and this is important because John Nelson later told a television interviewer that he named Prince because he wanted him to do everything that he wanted to do. Before Prince ever took a single breath, he had that put upon him. His identity was already a vessel for his father's unfulfilled ambitions, because for the most part, they were unfulfilled. He was not born as himself. He was born as his father's second chance. We know that his parents' marriage was volatile. He has spoken about that. It was physical. It was terrifying for a child to witness. Prince wrote about this in the pages of his unfinished memoir, The Beautiful Ones. I read it. In his own handwriting, he wrote, "The wound of your parents fighting is chilling when you're a child. Absolutely. If it happens to become physical, it can be soul crushing." That's incredible insight. And he has that insight as an adult. We don't know if he had it as a child because children cannot assimilate that type of information. But what Prince also revealed in those pages was something I would say that's arguably more damaging than the fighting itself. His mother used him as a buffer. And we do see this in abusive relationships. Children become either a buffer or something else. His mother would come into his bedroom while his parents were arguing, crying and asking him to intervene. And now think about that, asking a child to intervene. She wanted him to tell his father to be nice to her. A child made responsible for the emotional stability of two adults who were supposed to protect him. As the psychological literature on parentified children is a bit ambiguous, I would say, reading through most of it, preparing for this. But when a child is required to manage the emotional lives of caregivers, they learn two things simultaneously. That love requires management, that somehow you've got to manage love. Now think about what that does to future relationships. And also that you're never truly safe. Now, if you've ever read any of Bowlby or Engworth's literature, you can find a lot of this information. But his parents divorced when Prince was 10. Now, that's still quite impressionable. He began moving between households then, so no stability at all. His mother then remarried a man called Haywood Baker, by all accounts, with whom Prince had a very deeply troubled relationship. Now, two sources in the suppressed Edelman Netflix documentary, I'll come to that later as well, they claim that Prince told them that Baker had locked him in his bedroom as a young child, with food passed through the door. Prince's father, who really inspired him musically, had left his piano behind when he moved out, giving Prince the instrument that would become his entire world. Eventually, he threw Prince out of the house when he found him in bed with a girl, a 12-year-old boy, put on the street by both parents. Now, I could go into the whole issue of looking for love at that young age through sex, but that's a whole nother video. Prince went to live with the Anderson family, his friend Andre's family, the only people who had offered him something resembling unconditional shelter. And here is where the wound crystallizes into something quite precise and quite clinical. Prince was not just abandoned. Prince was abandoned despite being extraordinary. He'd already demonstrated by the age of 12 that he had a musical gift that was almost without precedent. People saw it. People talked about it. He was visibly undeniable, exceptionally talented at that young age. And his parents left anyway. The impact, the conclusion that a child draws from that type of experience is catastrophic. If my gifts cannot protect me from abandonment, if even being exceptional is not enough to make someone stay, then nothing is. The wound is not simply, I was left. The wound then becomes, even my gifts could not save me. That conclusion would drive every relationship he ever had for the rest of his life. Some of you may have already heard about attachment theory. So in psychology, there's a concept called disorganized attachment. And it usually occurs when the very people a child depends on for safety are also the source of fear and pain. The child cannot approach and cannot retreat. They're stuck. They are trapped between need and terror. They know they need support and help. They cannot survive without it, but they're terrified to ask for it. The research on disorganized attachment in children is consistent, and it's heartbreaking to read. These children grow into adults who want intimacy, but they're terrified of it at the same time. They push people away before they can be pushed. So they drop you before you can drop them. They control relationships because for them, control feels like the only alternative to abandonment. And I will say in the most extreme cases, they become the abandoner. Because if you're always the one who leaves, you can never be left. There is a second mechanism here at work in Prince's psychology, and that is even more specific and even more important for understanding what he did to the people around him. The research on narcissistic injury, the wound that forms when a child's need for consistent, unconditional love is met with inconsistency, with criticism, or with abandonment, it shows a consistent pattern. People think narcissists are so confident and in control. It's just the opposite. So the injured child does not simply become fearful of others. They develop what we call projective identification. Now, I've seen this up close, up personal in my clinical work. They take the intolerable feelings inside themselves, the shame, the inadequacy, the terror of abandonment, and they project it outward. They project those feelings outward. They're unbearable to hold. They make other people carry what they cannot carry themselves. It's unbearable for them. And here is the specific incident or mechanism that explains Prince's behavior with extraordinary precision. Prince did not just abandon talented people. He chose the most talented people he could find. He elevated them, and then he abandoned and diminished them. He punished them, not despite their talent. He punished them because of it. The child who was told implicitly that even his gifts weren't enough to make someone stay spent his adult life proving that same lesson true. He found extraordinary people, extraordinarily talented people. He saw their gifts clearly. He spotted those gifts. He chose them deliberately. They may not have had the best singing voice at times, but they had something else. But then he treated them exactly as he'd been treated. Even with that level of talent, it's still not enough. He was not doing this consciously. For all you out there going, oh, he wasn't that bad. It wasn't conscious. He was running the same script that he'd been given. This is where the surrogate fathers come in. So people like Larry Graham. Now, I'm jumping ahead a bit. This is where the Steven Tyler, Led Zeppelin thread lives, okay? It's not just a digression. It's the thesis made visible through creative behavior. So a child without stable parents does not stop needing parents. The parents may be unavailable, but it doesn't mean they don't need them. In books, they need them. In teachers, in music, Prince found his surrogate fathers in sound. Jimi Hendrix, James Brown. If she were a man, Joni Mitchell, I have to throw her in there. Their harmonic sophistication influenced him more than most people acknowledge. And the rock bands, now this is something interesting to me. A lot of fans wish he'd never listened to rock because Prince loved Led Zeppelin. He absorbed Aerosmith and he took from both without credit because taking without acknowledgement was the only model of relationship he'd ever been given. And we will see that thread continue and continue and continue, taking people's ideas, their bass lines, their harmonies, their lyrics, and not giving them credit for it, which connects these threads in a way that is almost too perfect to be accidental. Now, just quickly, Steven Tyler, Aerosmith frontman, of course, developed one of rock's most iconic stage props, the scarf tied to the microphone stand. Now, in preparation for this video, I looked it up, and lo and behold, there was a Rolling Stone Steven talking about how it came about, not through deliberate design, but through an act of abandonment. Okay, you can't make this stuff up. So, his girlfriend at the time left him for, again, a synergy here, Jimmy Page. The Yardbirds were visiting, they were performing, and she left Stephen. She threw his clothes out of a window, or just out. I can't remember if it was out of a window, maybe I made that up. But she threw his clothes out, and Stephen went to retrieve his belongings from the street before a gig. He grabbed a shirt and tied it to his microphone stand. He liked it, so it stayed. It was a mainstay. The scarf became Aerosmith's most recognizable visual signature. Prince, the child, who was repeatedly put on the street, you see the connection here, who wrote Sister with the line, "Don't put me on the streets again," or "Don't put me on the street again," who was thrown out by his mother, his father, bounced between homes. He saw that image and he claimed it. He did not know the scarf's origin story. He wouldn't have done. But some part of him recognized it. This is the collective unconscious that we refer to. The way abandoned people recognize each other across rooms, across genres, across decades. The way abandoned people are brought together in relationships. The abandoned borrowing from the abandoned, without either of them knowing the connection. And the man whose girlfriend left him for Jimmy Page unknowingly passed something to the artist, who later played a Whole Lotta Love as a tribute to the band that same girlfriend's new lover led. I love connecting the threads. Now, this has always fascinated me. There are people out there, because I've read people talking about this, who resist the idea that Prince was influenced by rock music. Incredible. Listening to his first few albums, I mean, it's obvious that, a black artist of his stature would look to Zeppelin or Aerosmith for anything. That resistance says more about our need to put artists in boxes than it does about Prince, because Prince did not see those boxes. He didn't. He saw music. He transformed it so completely that the origin became invisible, which is exactly what he did with his pain. You can see Prince using the scarf technique, the scarf, in I Want to Be Your Lover video. In 1987, after disbanding the Revolution, at the peak of their powers, Prince released Sign of the Times. It is widely considered one of the greatest albums ever made, a double album of extraordinary range. emotional depth, musical complexity. And Prince played almost every single instrument on it himself. That's not surprising. This is presented almost universally as evidence of his genius. And it is. It really is. But it is also evidence of something else entirely.
If you're ready for exclusive soul-nourishing content that you won't find anywhere else, become a subscriber on Apple Podcasts and Spotify to access ad-free episodes with special guided meditations and visualizations for calm and clarity, and bonus episodes on spiritual growth, personal growth, energy healing, and spiritual awakening. Join the inner circle and experience deeper self-discovery today.
Sign of the Times was not just an album. It was a proof, a demonstration, executed at the highest possible level of craft, that he did not need them, that the revolution had been replaceable, that he was sufficient unto himself. And in psychology, this is called reactive self-sufficiency. The compulsive demonstration of independence in the immediate aftermath of severing a close relationship. It is not confidence at all. It is the exact opposite. Genuine confidence does not need to prove itself. Someone who's genuinely confident aren't looking to prove themselves. Reactive self-sufficiency is the sound of someone working furiously to convince themselves of something they do not fully believe. The album is brilliant and immersive. Prince's talent was real and immense and entirely his own. But brilliance and wound are not mutually exclusive. In fact, in Prince's case, they were inseparable. The wound was the engine that kept it going. Listen to Sign of the Times differently now. Listen to the grandeur of a man speaking, making an album for an audience of one. Himself, trying to prove something that no album could ever finally prove, that he was enough. He didn't need the revolution. He was enough. That he did not need anyone. He was enough. He was never going to convince himself. But my goodness, what music he made trying. The revolution, now let's pull back a bit. The revolution was not an exception. It was an instance of a pattern that ran across every relationship of his life. The revolution were not the first, and they were not the last. So let us go back to the very beginning of Prince's career, and let's trace this pattern through every significant relationship he ever had. Because once you see this, you cannot unsee it. Let's start with Andre Simone. The deepest betrayal. So, all the betrayals will run deep. But when Prince's father threw him out, the Anderson family took him in. Andre Simone's family gave Prince a home when both his parents had discarded him. What does it take for an adult to discard a child? Andre was his closest friend. The nearest thing to him that he had is like a close brotherly type relationship. Andre played bass in Prince's early band. He contributed ideas, bass lines, creative input, lyrics, and Prince, according to Andre's own later testimony, took those contributions without credit. He claimed them as his own. He used Andre's musical ideas, other projects, most notably The Time, without acknowledgement. Think about what it means to steal from a person, the very person who sheltered you, who gave you a roof over your head, the person whose family fed you when your own family would not. The psychology here is not mysterious, I'm afraid. Prince owed Andre something that he could never repay. Now, Andre wouldn't have known that, and nor would Prince. And the only way to neutralize an unpayable debt is to diminish the person to which it's owed. You make them smaller. You take away what they gave you and you claim it as your own. You reduce them so that the debt disappears. Andre left with bitter feelings that lasted for years. Let's go to Gail Chapman. Now, Gail Chapman was Prince's keyboardist before Lisa Coleman. She left in 1980, by all accounts. The documented reason is quietly devastating. She told Prince she needed more musical fulfillment and growth for herself. She had needs of her own, ambitions of her own, of course. She was not simply an instrument in Prince's orchestra, but she was a musician in her own creative life. She had other interests outside as well. How did Prince respond? He responded by demanding that she commit to short notice rehearsals. You had to be loyal. So she left. The moment that someone asserted a need of their own, the moment someone demonstrates that they were a full person with desires independent of Prince's, the relationship became untenable because a person with their own needs is a person who might one day put their needs first. A person who might leave. Better to make it impossible for them to stay. And then it all sorts itself out. Let's move over to Des Dickerson. So Des Dickerson was the hotshot guitarist that people knew in Minneapolis. People were talking about him before Prince broke through. And when he first heard Prince's debut album, he has admitted, it's documented, with what he would call, he thought it was youthful arrogance. And he said he felt a twinge of jealousy. I believe other people felt that as well. He thought he could do better. So he joined Prince's band. Now, he was brilliant in it. He co-sang lead vocals on 1999. He played the guitar solo on Little Red Corvette. This is the one that Guitar World ranked among some of the greatest solos ever recorded. And he left citing religious reasons or religious beliefs following a born-again conversion, I think in 1980. And he said performing sexually explicit material had begun to conflict with his conscience. The religious reason appears genuine. But Dickerson himself has acknowledged the competitiveness, the jealousy, the sense that the spotlight he had once held in Minneapolis had moved to someone else, Prince. So the religious conversion gave him a very clean exit from what was becoming an increasingly complicated dynamic. Now, what I find revealing in all of this is not why Dickerson left. Publicly, in a subsequent recording, Prince made a pointed reference to Dickerson's departure. It was a calculated lyrical jab that Dickerson himself described as typical Prince. A gesture that was either good-natured ribbing or quietly nasty, depending on how you see it. And what's even more interesting in analyzing this is that Prince could not just simply let Des leave. He couldn't let someone leave. He just couldn't. The departure had to be marked. It had to be noted. It had to be managed. So even departures he had agreed to required a final word. The pattern extends beyond Prince's own bands. The artists that he created, he managed and controlled, they tell the same story with different names. The Time, Sheila E., Vanity 6, Morris Day. These were not independent artists who happened to work with Prince, like Sheena Easton or Sinead O'Connor. They were Prince's creations, discovered, named, styled, musically directed, financially controlled by him. And financial control was where the punishment became most explicit in my analysis. Multiple accounts confirm that Prince used financial dependency as a mechanism of control. So there were artists in his orbit, and they were paid in ways that prevented them from building independent lives. They suffered financially. They went through a few hardships that they shouldn't have gone through. It appeared that the more talented they were, the more their success reflected well on his creative vision. The more tightly the financial screws were then turned. Now, many of these artists have written memoirs. Unfortunately, Vanity passed away before she could... Well, she did write one, but anyway, we'll come to that. Prince was not just punishing them for failure. He was punishing them for succeeding. Because success meant independence, and independence meant they might leave. And them leaving on their own terms was the one thing that he could not survive. He made sure they could not afford to do so. Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, yes, we know the story. Yes, they were looking at sort of extra work. They were looking to expand their repertoire. It makes sense. Aren't people allowed to do that with side projects? And some of you will say, well, Prince only stuck to what he said. He kept his word. You mustn't work with other people, and you must be on time for rehearsals. So he only did what he was meant to do. I would say it was deeper than that. Jam and Lewis leaving, going to record on this extra project, might seem like a simple thing. But when Prince found out, to someone with that kind of wound, when you have an abandonment wound that big, that raw, that open, that would have signaled to Prince, they're leaving. So I must get rid of them before they leave me. I'm afraid it's written all over it. Why? Because this is his pattern. This is his go-to. This is what he does to protect himself, to save himself from that wound being pressed on. I always give this example with wounds, with psychological wounds. You know how as a child, I don't know, maybe adults still do this, when you have a wound, when you've hurt yourself, and sometimes you keep pressing on the wound, going, ooh, 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 You press on the wound. Why do people do that? Why do you think people, it hurts. You know it hurts. Why are you doing that? Why you continue to press on the wound? Is it to feel the pain? When you have a wound, and I use that example because when you have a wound, you control the pressing upon. There's something instinctively you know not to press too hard. You press just enough to know that it hasn't fully healed. But the difference is you are in control of that wound. No one else is. You're in control. It doesn't matter if you got it through someone else. At this time, you're in control of it. When someone with that type of wound feels a threat to the wound being pressed upon, they will do anything to ensure that it's not touched. And Prince would have abandoned Jam and Lewis before they could abandon him. Now, that speaks to what I spoke to before. He only chose the most talented people. He knew the talent. He pushed them. Jimmy Jam has talked about how he used to push him to do this, do that, do it all. He used to push people to their greatest. He knew how talented the time was. It's been documented that he saw the time as his only competition. He could see their genius. He could see their talent. So everything within him would have been saying, they're on their way out. They're leaving me. I can't let that happen. That presses on my wound. Absolutely not. You're fired. You're fired. You're fired. Get out. The pattern repeats beyond that. If you're into living with purpose, clarity, and soul, the Aligned Living newsletter is exactly what you need. I'm genuinely obsessed with creating it. Every week, I share strategies that work, drawn from close to 30 years as a therapist and soulful living being, plus powerful insights into spiritual and personal growth. You'll get access to free resources, guided meditations, discounts on events and courses, and tools to help you shift your energy, habits, and mindset, all free when you sign up. I delve into hidden dynamics that are at work in your relationships and your workplace, and you'll have exclusive access to when the episodes are released. Plus, you'll also have exclusives on cohorts and legacy memberships when they become live. I'm building this with heart and honesty, and I'd love for you to be a part of it. Head to the link in the show notes and join me today. To Prince, success meant independence, and he couldn't have that. That independence meant to him that someone was on their way out, that they were leaving him, quite possibly would be leaving him. He would have done everything in his power to stop that happening. Not the leaving, but the person leaving him. So he made sure, by keeping them financially dependent, he made sure they couldn't afford to. And with Jam and Lewis, that would have been extra money and more success, which is exactly what happened. Everything that I have just laid out, the control, the financial punishment of talented people, the preemptive abandonment, this is a pattern. And it doesn't just stay in the music industry. It's universal. And if something that I've just described is nagging at you, something may feel uncomfortably familiar, the Toxic Workplace Recovery Kit, which is linked in the description, is going to give you a language for what you've been living through. The link is there for whenever you're ready. I'm going to delve into a topic, and it's a difficult one, but it's about the women in Prince's life. This is the clearest evidence of his psychology in operation. One woman was never enough. And it's not because Prince was simply unfaithful, though he was, but because every woman would have represented the exact same surge. Will you be the one who stays? Now, I know how this looks. Vanity, Susanna, Matey, or Mighty, I never know, Carmen. There are many. Each woman chosen with intensity, elevation. They were celebrated. They were controlled. And then he abandoned them before they could abandon him first. Prince wrote in his memoir that by watching his parents' marriage end, it had taught him something he never unlearned, that there is some part of your heart that should never be given away. And that's quite a sad revelation, to sequester your heart in that way, because otherwise you close yourself off to people. He also wrote that he said, I can always let my guard down when there's a woman present. Now, my analysis of that is, women were the only people, yes, that he trusted even partially. And he knew that he could trust them partly because he controlled them, and he did control those women. The trust was conditional on the control. It was conditional on the control. Remove the control and the trust evaporated. Every woman he ever left carried the wound of abandonment without any closure. None of them had closure. He didn't even see some of them ever again. He did not end relationships. He withdrew from them. He disappeared. He created distance until the relationship just died of neglect and then moved on without explanation. He wanted them to feel what he had been made to feel. This is not consciously done. It's not deliberately done. But the wound always finds its own expression. He had been given no closure by the people who abandoned him, so he gave none in return. The most haunting illustration of this relationship was between Vanity, Denise Matthews, and Prince. Vanity was one of the greatest loves of his life. There were others, I believe, especially the lady Susan, and I think there was one more. But now this is a bit of a difficult one for me, but I knew Vanity, and when I moved to the UK, we kept in touch. She definitely had some emotional problems, some psychological problems, I'm afraid, I have to say. She had a way about her, quirkiness, but one of the kindest people. I don't believe she allowed a lot of people in. I think people believed that they knew her well. I certainly didn't know her well, but I knew her. She did speak about him, but what I will say is that mostly, not always, but mostly it was good and with care. And she never stopped loving him. But from everything that she'd ever told me about their relationship, she knew that that would never come together again. She knew that. And also that it should never come together again. Because that relationship, and hear what I'm saying. I'm not blaming him for any of this. She didn't blame him either. She became, in later years, very aware of her psychological problems. Very aware. Very, very aware. But they did share something in common as far as ego and as far as not trusting people. And because of her conversion, which is quite interesting, he had the same kind of religious conversion. She thought she knew more than a trained professional might know, and he thought the same. But she mostly spoke well of him. But in preparation for this, I was looking at some of our old emails, and I will say that a very positive, very encouraging, very supportive person, and really, when we talked about relationships and beginnings and endings and all of that stuff, because we did, we talked about a lot about pets, a lot about pets, pet food. She gave me lots of, yeah, there was lots of stuff. And, but she was never really that judgmental. And I'm saying this because she didn't blame him. She pretty much blamed herself for what she went through. And she could see the pattern. So she used to read a lot too. So she did see the pattern. And she was quite skeptical about going into another relationship. It wasn't because, it was because of Prince. It was because of the difficulties and how she chose someone like him and how they went through what they went through. And she was afraid she would repeat the pattern. And that kept her single. I believe that kept her single. So there was a lot there, but she spoke of him with love until she died. She died in February 2016, and Prince died in April 2016, 4 months apart. And then he followed her 4 months later, as if even in death, he could not let someone else leave first. But she did. I would say she's the only one who left first. Now, this is a very sensitive topic, so I'm going to handle it with a lot of care, though I must present the facts. Prince and his wife, Mighty, had a son. He was born with a rare genetic condition. He lived for 6 days. Now, Prince and his wife appeared on a talk show. And he gave the impression, I found her very silent, but he gave the impression that the son was still alive and well when he was not. He'd already died. And there is no charitable reading of this that does not involve Prince's psychology of control operating at its most extreme here. The death of a child is perhaps the single most profound loss that a human being could experience. For Prince, a man whose entire psychological architecture was built to prevent the experience of loss, it was potentially annihilating. His response was to control the narrative, to present a reality that had not occurred, to manage the story the way he managed every other story by refusing to let it be told on anyone else's terms. Even grief was not allowed to be witnessed. Now we know the public would have gathered around him, supported him. There would have been an outpouring of support. But that didn't happen. The public weren't given that chance. So you may be saying, oh, analyzing this is just cruel. He lost a child. Have some compassion. Well, you're absolutely right that Prince lost a child. And the pain that loss, would have presented was real. It was profound. It deserves respect. Nothing in this analysis dismisses that pain. What it observes is how that pain was managed. And we'll talk about pain management again. not as a criticism of Prince, but as a window into the depth of his rigidity, of his psychological defenses. A man who had learned from infancy that vulnerability meant annihilation, could not afford to grieve publicly. He could not trust that process. That is not a character flaw. It is a wound. And understanding it as such is an act of compassion. The man who controlled everything. And when we talk about pain management, the man who controlled everything was controlled in the end by the pain that he could not name publicly. And by the time Prince was in his 50s, his body was in significant and chronic pain. 38 years of performing in 4-inch heels, jumping off high piano risers, doing the splits in hard places, hard stages, running, leaping, jumping, doing splits in the air, performing for 3, 4, 5 hours at a stretch, in footwear that was never designed for the demands that he placed on it. Sheila E. confirmed on Good Morning America after his death that Prince had damaged his hips severely through years of jumping off risers and stages and equipment in high heels. It's documented that Prince had hip surgery in 2010. He reportedly became dependent on Percocet following the surgery. By 2016, his physician was treating him for opioid withdrawal, anemia, and fatigue. And at this time, he started walking with a cane. People who saw it assumed it was a fashion statement. People who knew him well knew it was something else. The pain had become far too much, far too intolerable. And now it wasn't just the physical pain, it was the pain of addiction. And that is when the stronger painkillers came in. Prince, who was notoriously known for banning drugs and alcohol from his circle, who enforced teetotalism on anyone who entered his building, was quietly, privately managing a painkiller addiction that had escalated beyond what we even know about. Because I believe he would have had several admissions. The man who controlled everything, the man who controlled the image of every person around him, he even had his girlfriends dress like him. And even if he didn't come up with it, they did. Although Vanity did like to dress like her boyfriend, she copied Adam Ant quite a bit. But again, that was after she had copied Prince. The man who controlled the narrative of his son's death, who controlled the stories about himself so effectively that it took 40 years for accounts of physical and emotional abuse to reach the public. That man could not control pain. The autopsy report confirmed that Prince had taken what he believed were Vicodin tablets to manage chronic hip pain. Those tablets were counterfeit. They were laced with fentanyl, a synthetic opioid 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine. He had no prescription for fentanyl. He almost certainly did not know what he was taking. He died on the 21st of April, 2016, alone, in a lift at Paisley Park. Not in a hospital, not surrounded by those whose lives he'd affected and shaped, but alone in a building that he owned, in the body that he'd driven beyond its limits, from a substance he took in secret to manage a pain that he would never publicly admit to. And he died hours before a scheduled meeting with an addiction specialist that someone had arranged for him. He was hours away from help. The man who could not tolerate anyone getting too close, anyone getting close enough to truly see him, he died without anyone close enough to save him. In February 2025, Netflix and Prince's estate jointly announced that a 9-hour documentary about Prince's life, 5 years in the making, which was directed by Oscar-winning filmmaker Ezra Edelman, featured over 70 interviews, including Wendy Melvoin and Lisa Coleman, that it would never be released. Edelman had been given access to Prince's vault, the vast archive of recordings and materials that Prince had. He'd spent his life protecting. He'd conducted interviews with musicians, with collaborators, romantic partners, family members, engineers, other associates. The documentary had been screened for critics and filmmakers, including Steve James and others. They praised the film. They saw it as very ambitious, and they saw it as emotional rigor. The estate, however, submitted a 17-page document of objections. Edelman stated publicly that the document was full of editorial issues, not factual corrections. They wanted certain interviews removed, certain sequences cut, certain aspects of Prince's life, his personal life, his treatment of the people around him, his emotional and physical abuse. They wanted it all erased from the record. Edelman said they are afraid of his humanity. And then he said something that should stop you completely. It's probably the closest anyone's ever gotten to Prince's real psychology here and the psychology of people around him. Edelman noted that the estate's behavior in suppressing the documentary, the controlling of the narrative, the erasure of uncomfortable truths, the refusal to allow the full picture to be seen, was itself similar to Prince's own reputation as a control freak. Now that psychological insight, maybe without him even knowing, the pattern did not die though with Prince. It was inherited by the people who control his legacy, his estate now. The vault that Prince spent his life protecting is still being protected. Still being protected. They're behaving exactly like him. The stories that he didn't want to be told are being suppressed. The control is still in operation. When the documentary's cancellation was announced, the estate posted an Instagram video montage of Prince with photographs set to his 1982 song Free. Oh, one of my favorite songs. But the caption read, "The vault has been freed." That's psychological fodder for me. The vault, the place that controlled the secrets, was being formed as liberation, even after Prince's death. So even in death, the narrative is being managed. Even in death, vulnerability is repackaged as strength. It is incredible. The narrative, the action, the psychology continues right through to the people in charge of his legacy. We began this deep dive with what was taken from you, the music that felt written for you, the world that the revolution built, the conversation between Prince and his audience that was closed without warning, without a farewell. I told you that what you felt had a name and that you were abandoned. And now you know why. Prince Rogers Nelson was a child who learned the hardest possible lesson at the youngest possible age. That love is conditional. That even the most extraordinary gifts cannot guarantee that someone will stay, that they'll be loyal, or keep you safe. That the only safety available is the safety that you build yourself, with walls high enough that no one can get close enough to leave. He built those walls, and inside of them, he created some of the most extraordinary music the 20th century produced. The revolution were not incidental to that creation. They were essential to it. They were the rare group of people, talented and perceptive and loyal enough to get through the first layer of the walls. They were the closest to the real Prince, to create something with him that he could not create alone. And that was precisely what he could not forgive them for. Because to need someone, truly need them creatively, emotionally, as equals, was the most dangerous thing he could do. It meant they had power over him. It meant they could leave. It meant he could be left again. So he left first. He left the revolution. He left Susanna. He left Vanity. He left Andre, who had given him a home. He left every person who got close enough to matter. And he spent the rest of his career, brilliant career, extraordinary career, proving that he had not needed any of them. Sign of the Times says otherwise. Every note of it. The wound was his genius. The genius was the wound. They were never two things. They were always one. They were synergetic. On the 21st of April, Prince Rogers Nelson, in 2016, died alone in a lift in the building he owned. His blood contained fentanyl at more than double the concentration recorded in fatal overdose cases. He was hours away from an appointment with someone who might have helped him. He never made it. The man who spent his entire life refusing to be seen died in the most private way imaginable. Unseen, alone, in a building full of everything that he created and nothing that he had kept. No, that's not entirely true. He kept the music. He kept all of it. The vault is full of it. Hundreds of unreleased recordings. Albums the world has never heard, will never hear. Songs he made and locked away because releasing them would have meant giving something of himself that he could not give. He kept the music because, you see, the music was the one place the wound was ever fully safe to speak. And you heard it. That's why it hurt. That's why you cried when he died. Across the years, across the albums, across the performances, you heard something in Prince that you recognized without being able to name it. A longing, an ache, something searching. Now you know what it was searching for. The same thing it always was. Someone who would not leave. If what you've watched today resonated in any way, if you recognize any of these patterns from your own experience, your own workplace, your own relationships, then let me know in the comments. The Toxic Workplace Recovery Kit was made for you. The link is in the description. It will give you the framework, the language, the processes, and the tools to understand what you're dealing with and how to move through it. And if you want to go deeper into the hidden dynamics of high-performing and high dysfunctional groups, the next video on screen is for you. I'll see you there.